the sea was really troubled and very gray. It was very dark. It was really stormy, and it was very, very windy.
Once we completely lost power, there was a giant hissing noise that just, in a silence, that was, it's just kind of one of those things, you hear it in the movies.
I recall hearing a transmission that said, "That's it, we're going in," or "That's it, we're going down." And that makes your blood freeze.
Planning all the way down to just what would be the best way to get onto the water.
We hit and water came in on my legs and it was cold and the plane swung around.
They're moving, they're waving. All right, we got survivors.
They just couldn't hold on, and it was, I thought it was just tragic when she went back in the water.
With bubbles coming out of his mouth, death white, he appeared to me to be dead. Really good that we really didn't know how life-threatening it was.
The rescue, the incredible story of courage, bravery, and unselfishness in the daring rescue of 7 missionaries against impossible odds from the frigid Bering Sea. Way up north, in Alaska and the Russian Far East, is a part of the world where the Lord has truly laid his hand. Majestic mountains, massive glaciers, an abundance of wildlife, an area so vast that your nearest neighbor might be 100 miles away. Into this pristine land, rugged individuals for years have braved the unforgiving wilderness to spread the gospel in these remote villages. This is where this story begins.
We were in Russian Far East on a religious and humanitarian mission, a place called Bering Sea July. We brought 3,000 pounds of food, 1,000 pounds of medicine, 500 Bibles, and several of us, actually a convoy of 3 or 4 airplanes, went over to a community where Americans had all but not ever been before, and no churches or priests or ministers had ever gone. And we preached and sang the gospel for a number of days, and a number of people came to the Lord. It was a marvelous experience. Probably the most poignant moment there for me personally was when our interpreter tugged at my shoulder and said, "Dave, Rosa would like to be baptized. Would you baptize Rosa?" And the former head of the Communist Party in that community for 25 years was baptized, as well was her grandson. And we went into a little side room, maybe 6, 8, 9, 10 of us, and we baptized those 2 people, and we wept. And God had broken through in the heart of a person who did not know that there was a God of love, but then who came to know that God of love through His Son, Jesus Christ. And we were on our way back, and we came out of Bering Sea July to Providencia.
There were high winds also, so going into Providencia, it had already been a rather stimulating flight because we were coming in a back route and had to go around some mountains, and you know, we were banking kind of heavily and everything, and off and on I'd look up at the gas gauges and they weren't full.
Well, we knew we were going to need more fuel, and so we put in 30 gallon. And I looked at the fuel gauges and it showed more than half. The auxiliary tank showed at least 10 gallon in there, in each one of those. So I figured that was enough for at least 2 hours. We only needed an hour and 30 minutes flying time.
And there are 2 high mountains that cover over the airport on either side, and it's a real foreboding sort of place. And I'm kind of sensitive to things like that, and for me it was just a feeling of a heavy shadow on us. And it was cold in the stone airport, and there's no place to get a nice cup of coffee or something to eat, and everybody is stern in their Russian uniforms and hardly any smiles, and we just had sort of a difficult time getting through. And then we had another passenger who was coming through, a Russian, and his papers weren't in order, and it was just a really uncomfortable time. And I was very anxious to get out of there and get back onto St. Lawrence Island and back into Nome as soon as possible.
Leaving Russia, we refueled with American fuel, because the Russian aviation fuel is so poor and standard, it would really damage the engines to the American planes. So they had a fuel reserve over in Russia for that purpose. And we were bringing the empty cans back to the United States to have them refueled so that we could come back another time.
I remember hollering out the door in Russia that there's no more room because the back had filled up with our sound equipment and luggage and so forth, and now these gas cans, and they're pretty bulky cans, and they kept coming. And I remember holding one on my lap thinking, this is kind of dumb. And it was kind of an awkward deal to hold. And then I looked down, and the aisle of the plane was exactly the width of the can. And so I thought, well, good, that'll sit there just fine.
Put them down, you know, the aisle, and Dave Cochran crawled in over them, and Don Wharton was sitting right in front of me. And I was right behind him, and the exit door was to the left, and then Cary was behind me. And a Russian guard came up to us, and he said, "Good luck." And Don Wharton and I kind of looked at each other and said, wow, I wonder what that meant exactly. It was just that kind of a situation, and they started up the engines.
And then across a little part of the Bering Sea, across the international date line to St. Lawrence Island. After we had officially re-entered United States space by a gentleman coming out from the village to stamp our passports and saying welcome home. The air traffic controller in Anchorage assigned us 7,000 feet as we were then going to fly 1 hour and 15 minutes to Nome. We were going to refuel here in Nome and go on to Shishmaref for a concert.
I got a request from Nome Flight Service for a clearance for a Navajo going from Gamble to Nome, which is very common. It was November 6 Sierra Foxtrot. And so I gave the aircraft a clearance, an IFR clearance from Gamble to Nome.
Navajo 6 Sierra Foxtrot, Anchorage Center. Fox, go ahead. Navajo 6 Sierra Foxtrot, roger. Verify 7,000. 7,000, that's affirmative. Navajo 6 Sierra Foxtrot, roger. You can expect a visual approach at Nome.
Aircraft departed, nothing unusual at all. Aircraft climbed to altitude.
And it was very, very turbulent, and I was just praying, oh Lord, please, could you clear the skies for us and give us a smooth flight, and oh, please help this not to be this turbulent. And we rose and we rose and we rose what seemed for me an eternity, and it seemed like we kept going higher and higher and higher, and all of a sudden we just broke into the most beautiful, clear, sunny, blue skies. It was just beautiful, and the sun was so bright and so yellow, and I just said, oh, thank you, Jesus. I just am so grateful for this.
As the aircraft was halfway between Gamble and Nome, I was relieved by Greg Rakowski, and he took over the sector by himself, and I stepped back hoping to have dinner. As it turns out, I wasn't about to get dinner.
I had asked him before we left La Valencia to sit in the cockpit with him so I could take some photographs. And so that's how I ended up there. And I was just taking pictures and conversing and getting a little better view.
We took off from Gamble, and we got up above the clouds, and it was really sunny, and people started falling asleep, and it was really a nice flight.
So we were flying along, and I was just relaxed then, and I just kept all of it, you know, looking at the gas gauges, and they were just getting perilously low. And pretty soon I turned around to Cary, and I said to Cary, you know, look at the gas gauges. And he was very worried also.
I can sleep in a plane under almost every circumstance, and I was facing backwards in the plane in one of the two seats facing backwards. And I was blissfully, ignorant of, the impending danger.
Dave Cochran was having Brian do some things. I saw him reach around pretty soon and get the green instruction book, and I saw Dave Cochran fiddling with gauges, and then all of a sudden, I mean, they were just like on empty. The one on the left wasn't quite.
When everything started to take place, he had me look through the emergency procedures manual so that possibly I'd be able to help him just double check and reaffirm that he was doing the fuel transfer properly.
I woke up to a chug-a-chug, and I thought in my mind, because my husband's a pilot and he was over there too, that doesn't matter. They fly on one engine all the time. They're trained to do that, fly with one engine.
And then, of course, there was that ultimately fierce motion of the plane. It's a side-to-side motion, and once you experience it, you never forget it, and you know it's not like anything you've ever felt before in a plane.
I felt a very unordinary kind of motion, and I opened my eyes and I looked back to see everybody else in the plane with their eyes like this, and they're pointing up to the fuel gauge, and I turned my head to look what they were looking at, and it became apparent that we were running dangerously low of fuel.
It's a very eerie feeling when you've never experienced anything like that, and that frightened me so much.
Well, I figured it must be running out of fuel because I checked everything else, and the only thing left would have been fuel that would have given a problem. And so then I figured, well, I've got maybe 5 minutes more on that other engine, that's going to be about it. We were then at about 7,000 feet when the first engine quit, and I definitely recognized that there was a problem there. So then I called the Alaska Center.
Anchorage Center, this is 6 Sierra Foxtrot on 133.3. Level 6 Sierra Foxtrot, go ahead. Indicators were apparently off. We've run out of fuel on one tank, and we're descending now towards Sledge Island. And I'm not sure how much fuel we got left in the other one. November 6 Sierra Foxtrot, roger, you declaring an emergency at this time? Yes, please.
When 6 Sierra Foxtrot came on frequency and said, well, we have lost one engine and we don't know how much fuel we have left. There appears to be some problem with our fuel gauge and we're not able to maintain altitude. And that's when I knew that we had a pretty serious problem going on, because from where he was, if he couldn't maintain altitude, he was not going to make land.
I was also scanning the horizon because I was wondering, is it possible that we can make it to land? We're never going to make it to Nome. By then I knew that something was up.
After the second engine quit, and then I started trying to hold about 130 miles an hour for the best glide speed. Then I could see we weren't going to be able to make it to land.
I know some of us, at least maybe Don, he and I were talking and we were speculating, do you suppose he's going to try to land on the top of that island? But, oh, I hope not. I was thinking, oh, I hope he doesn't try to do that, because there's no telling if that would be a safe landing. So we began to kind of all prepare for this crashing into the ocean.
It took about a minute to fall about 3,500 feet, during which time we were having an informal prayer meeting.
Of course it causes a catch in your breathing, because you never want to hear those words, but you do the best you can. And I remember that right after Chris plugged back in and we completed the emergency checklist, which consists of how many people do you have on board, how much fuel have we got left. At that point, we'd done pretty much all we could, and I felt kind of helpless, and it bothered me. I wanted to do more. There's someone in your area of jurisdiction that's in trouble, and you'd like to, if you could, just reach out and guide it safely to the ground, but that's not always possible. And I felt I kept bugging Dave.
Right now, 6 Sierra Foxtrot, say type of correction, say souls on board. 7 souls on board.
Understand 7 souls on board, and you're descending into where at this time?
Towards Sledge Island, to be over land.
Sledge Island, understand, thank you. All right, just to clarify for Navo 6 Sierra Foxtrot, I understand that you have run out of fuel in one tank and you are unaware of the amount of fuel in the other tank, is that correct?
I knew I was bothering him, but I also knew that I had to keep track of where he was.
Our fuel just went out.
Understand your fuel has gone out at this time, Navo 6 Sierra Foxtrot, roger.
I heard Dave Cochran say Mayday, Mayday. I kept watching out the window, and I just really braced myself for the impact.
Well, I was watching for waves on the water to determine whether to land across the waves or in between them, and there wasn't any real definite pattern. There were just waves all over the place. And finally I saw one spot that looked like it might be just a little bit more clearer than the other spots. So I headed for that spot.
Notice, is there going to be an altitude conflict as we about 2 miles short of Sledge Island.
All right, Northwest 69, roger. Stand by, please. November 6 Sierra Foxtrot, I understand you're 2 miles short of Sledge Island now?
We hit the water at 90 miles an hour.
But I can still see that water just coming against the windshield of the plane and coming against the sides just ferociously.
The plane hit the water, we kind of stopped and skidded and spun around. And my first reaction was to make sure everybody was okay, and said, everybody, let's grab a gas can and get on out into the water, because the pilot, Dave, told us that the plane was, we were filling up the water pretty quick.
God gave Dave Cochran that once-in-a-lifetime landing.
November 6 Sierra Foxtrot, transmission was clipped.
I says, okay, everybody out. Throw out those cans and hang on to one of them. That was our flotation gear.
They said, okay, up and out, and I looked out the window. The window was not there. I looked out the window, and all these gas cans were out there. And for the life of me, a long time it took me to realize Don Wharton had opened up the window, and had he not, I think a lot of us could have been knocked unconscious with all those gas cans flying around.
So here's Pam and me, and we've got these cans, and we're both looking at each other, and we're saying, well, let's get out in that together.
Out the plane we went, and about a minute later the plane sank, and we found ourselves in 3 to 5 foot swells.
We were all together, very much together at the beginning. But then just very quickly we began to separate.
Barb, she was trying to get with Dave Anderson, and I don't know what Dave was thinking, because he drifted off some other way, and then I never really seen Barb again. And when I had ran into Don, I didn't know these people, I didn't even know Don's name. I thought his name was John. And so Don linked up legs. We underwater, we crossed our legs together, and I think that kept in the warmth.
Brian did what coaches do, and they sometimes stand on the sidelines and say, hey, you can do this. And well, Brian wasn't in the sidelines, he was in the ocean with the rest of us. But at one point he quoted a couple of verses from Scripture. He said at one point, and his voice carried over the water, almost like he had a microphone, God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. And another time, some minutes later, he hollered, this is the day the Lord has made, let us rejoice and be glad in it. And most of us at the time, or at least a couple of us, thought, it's the wrong verse. This is not a rejoice and be glad in it kind of deal. And but also, he had some very practical things to say to one person in the group who was really losing hope, and really help that person hold on, quite literally hold on.
While we were in the water, we just said prayers and shouted encouragement, and everything we could do just to keep going, keep each other keeping afloat.
We were 22.5 miles from Nome, 2.5 miles from an uninhabited island called Sledge Island that Captain James Cook named back in the 1700s. And the water temperature was 36 degrees.
When that water came in on me, it was cold, but when I jumped in, it wasn't.
The truth of the matter is that we were in such shock at the beginning of this you know, getting out of the plane, we were in such shock that the adrenaline or whatever kind of system kicks in our bodies so that you don't really feel how bad it really is. And hypothermia, by definition, is low heat. It's a lowering of the general body heat. Now this is a variable thing, and generally it's considered to be about 95 degrees. And then once, let's say, the shock wore off, then we were so numb we couldn't feel how cold the water was. Immersion in cold water, maybe near freezing, 33 degrees, as it often is in the Bering Sea in the North Pacific. You're just one small unit in a huge ocean. Your core temperature is 98. That huge ocean, hundreds of square miles of water that's cold, is leaching heat from your body, and that doesn't take very long, and that depends on your physiological state, on your age, on your weight, on the kind of clothing you have, on your activity, and your psychological being, and whether you give up or you keep fighting.
I always just felt right at the time that, well, Scripture in Job, though the Lord slay me, yet will I trust him. I was going to trust the Lord through whatever he wanted to do.
Couldn't we make it? Couldn't we swim? And everybody agreed that no, it was best just to stay where we were and stay together, that we wouldn't be able to make it, that it would be a lot farther than we thought.
We've had people that have drowned in lakes in Alaska. Plane went down and they decided their beach was only 150 yards. They could swim that with one hand behind their back. Well, after about 30 or 40 yards of that kind of swimming, you've used up a lot of energy, a lot of calories, lost a lot of heat, are so cold you no longer can function and drown.
Everything kind of came back to my lifeguard training, you know, that empty gas cans are usually airtight and they'll keep you afloat if you need a flotation device, which obviously we kind of needed. And you know, in cold water, you need to try and keep your body out of the water as much as possible to stay as warm as possible.
If you take a shower and then a cold shower and lose some heat, as you know, very often you develop goose pimples, and that's the first sign that you're losing heat. And the erector pili, or the little hairs that are on your skin, rise up, and they're trapping air, warm air, trying to prevent the loss of heat. And following that, of course, you shiver. And that means at about 98 to 96 degrees, you're shivering. You're trying to manufacture heat with muscle. And from that, you have muscle tightness, which goes along with this. And then somewhere between, perhaps 98 and 96 degrees, you feel fatigue.
The waves kept kind of coming up and kind of going over our heads, whereas before, you know, we were more alert where we could hold our heads up. And I looked over at Don to see if he was having the same trouble.
Well, at about 96 degrees, the patients often are discoordinated. If they're walking, they stumble. They don't use their arms and legs very well if they're in water. I was paddling, and I was trying to get to my wife, Barb, and I got to her. And she had a black scarf around her neck, and I grabbed that scarf and I kind of put my hand on her shoulder, and she just got really frightened that I was going to push her down. So she said, "Oh, you're going to push me down," or something like that, and I held onto the scarf, and then the strangest thing happened. She floated away and I was left holding the scarf. It just came undone from around her neck, and I remember holding onto this scarf and I'm thinking, there she goes, and I've got a scarf. What am I going to do with this? And I let it go because I figured I can't do anything with this scarf. It's not going to do me any good at all. And then I tried to catch her again, and I never did. Then after that becomes muscle rigidity, and then the individual is usually disoriented. He falls. I can remember thinking, why can't I move as fast as I did a few minutes ago, you know? And I was trying, and my arm, it was getting slower and slower, and I was kind of angry with myself that I just couldn't, you know, force myself. And I had lost touch with her completely then. Somewhere at about 88 degrees Fahrenheit, there's a semi-comatose state.
And it was at that time that I was struggling, and waves are going over my head, and just seeing if Don was having the same problems I was. And I also remember there was one time I blacked out just for a second, and I got my adrenaline going and saying, no, you know, not yet.
At about 88 degrees, they go into coma, usually.
an 88 to 86, and then they do what I call to go in a metabolic icebox. They're so cold that their needs for oxygen are not as great as they were before, so they can persist and live there for a long period of time on land. On the other hand, in the water, you may lose heat so rapidly that whereas you might last 24 hours on land before you get into real trouble, on the water you could be in trouble, depending on who you are and where you are, within 20 minutes.
I remember really shivering and my teeth really chattering. I remember saying to myself, or out loud, who knows, I hope they come soon. I'm beginning to get really cold.
Because of the cold and the immobility of the hands and the arms and inability to swim, long before you die a death of hypothermia, most people will probably drown.
The first thing you want to do is get as many people informed about the situation as possible. Nome Flight Service, being the closest facility to Sledge Island and the incident that was happening, was the immediate first choice.
I think we were working on a bicycle at the time, and my son answered the phone, and I happened to be standing right there, and he handed me the phone, and it was a specialist on duty that advised me that he had been notified that there was an aircraft that was either running out of fuel or had ran out of fuel, because they probably had lost contact with him.
At the instant that our plane's tail disappeared in the water, there was a plane flying overhead on a regularly scheduled flight from St. Lawrence Island to Nome, and on that day, and that day only in the summer of 1993, he was 1 hour behind time.
I had just been looking out the left window, and I happened to see a small splash. The ocean had white caps on it. There was a lot of white caps, so it was a little windy. And, but I did notice a small splash out towards Sledge Island. I'd guesstimate 10 or 15 miles away. And I thought it was a whale.
I know Chris and I were both looking at the strips and looking at the scope and racking our brain trying to think, well, what else can we do? And that's when I saw the VFR target in the vicinity of Nome, and I said to Chris, I said, just go ask Nome if they're in contact with this aircraft. And if they are, have them put them up on my frequency, because we need some help.
Nome radio. Head Anchor Center Sector 3. There's an aircraft, I assume it's DVFR, about 30 miles west. Do you know where that would be?
Affirmative, Bering Air 4666.
That's 4666. Are you talking to him?
I might be able to raise him.
If you can raise him, could you send him up our frequency? I think we've lost 6 Sierra Foxtrot on frequency. He was over the shoreline, Sledge Island, last we heard.
Okay, I'll try to put him on your frequency.
Thank you very much, BC.
And I contacted Center, and Center said that they were having an aircraft that was in some difficulty, and he was trying to make it to Sledge Island. And for some reason, I just immediately knew that the splash that I'd seen had something to do with that airplane that was trying to make it to Sledge.
4666, go ahead.
Bering Air 4666, I have an aircraft in difficulty that is attempting a landing at Sledge Island. I wonder if it might be possible for you on either a VFR or an IFR clearance to deviate over to the top of Sledge Island on your way into Nome, and let me know if you can spot the aircraft on the beach.
See something go into the water off of Sledge Island. I thought it was a whale, but something did splash into the water to the southwest of Sledge.
And rather than doing that, I just went straight to where I estimated this splash was, and I kind of had it in my mind. It was about between 5 and 8 miles offshore from Sledge Island. That's what I thought. And so I just headed for the spot where I'd seen this small splash.
So he turned around and went back. He flew out directly over us, then turned around and flew directly over us again. I thought, oh, typical, they missed us. But after he'd gotten past us, probably a half mile or so, then he started circling.
I remember thinking that, you know, well, there they go. And I guess I said, don't they see us? And they didn't. And they came back, and they started to circle more or less over us, several hundred feet in the air. And they themselves were running low on fuel. This was not a part of their flight plan, obviously.
And by them about 3 or 4 miles, and then when I didn't pick them up, I just started a search pattern, you know, just a left-hand search pattern. And on one of my trips around the pattern, My passenger was sitting right behind me, shouted out, "I saw somebody!" Saw somebody in the water.
And then the other chilling moment came when he did come on frequency and said, "Senator, there's people in the water down here."
We're about 4 miles off a sledge, and it looks like there is splashing in the water here also.
All right, Bering Air 4666, just understand that you do see wreckage in the water, and it appears that there also is some sort of splashing in the water near the wreckage.
There are 2 people in the water and wreckage.
Bering Air 4666, roger that. Thank you much, sir.
And at that point, he signed off with us, and which was maddening. I wanted to know more, and went to talk to Nome Radio to help coordinate the rescue efforts.
So I told the specialist that had called that he should call 911, and the reason for that would be preparation of the city-owned or the city-run services, alert the hospital, because I know that there were probably more than a couple people on board the airplane.
The flight center here in Nome was trying to figure out who could go out there to do something, and something was not really clear. They found that the Evergreen helicopter was here, parked out at their hangar, and they had some difficulty getting hold of the pilot. They almost missed him.
Was just fixing to go out doors to go fishing when I got a call from flight service detailing a Navajo, that's an airplane that was in distress, about to ditch in the ocean off Sledge Island, and they requested if I could be of any assistance, and I told them that I could, so I immediately came down to the airport and made the helicopter ready to fly.
2 guys went with him, one of whom stopped at the Nome Fire Department on his way out to the hangar and picked up 7 body bags from the Nome Fire Department. He figured, I guess, that was the most logical thing to bring out, since nobody could survive very long in that water.
Chief of the volunteer fire department showed up and asked if I needed any help, and I told him to give me the strongest man that he had.
Everybody was getting ready to do something. He said he needed someone to go, so we grabbed a suit and jumped in his car and went to the airport.
And I had my mechanic also with me, and with the 3 of us, we at that time launched for Sledge Island.
Helicopter 500 Kilo Mike, Nome Radio, Nome Airport Advisory, wind 070 at 17. The altimeter 299.6, no other reported traffic.
0 Kilo Mike, and we're airborne at this time. Would you activate my VFR flight plan, please?
Helicopter 500 Kilo Mike, Wilco.
I really didn't know what to expect. On the way out, I was listening to the overhead cover with Terry Day and then Vic Olson, and at that time they were reporting visual contact with only several members.
I kept thinking in the water, well, this isn't so bad. And, you know, we were waiting for them to come and rescue us with their big helicopters and their nice baskets that came down. And it wouldn't be too long because, you know, obviously they knew we were here. So never really thought about that. And, of course, it didn't happen that way.
Normally we don't even, we don't have any gear for that type of rescue. And luckily there was a piece of rope in the helicopter. We ended up using it.
We both said, hey, you know, let us know what finally happens because it's going to affect how we sleep tonight.
And we both stepped back from the sector and pretty much were sure we had just talked to 7 people dying.
I fully expected to read about a tragic accident in the newspapers the next day where an aircraft went down with no survivors in the Bering Sea. It's just understood. You go down in the Bering Sea, your life expectancy without survival suits is very brief.
And when the helicopters finally came, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this isn't at all like I thought it was going to be.
I wasn't thinking much of anything until I saw the people floating in the water, and when I started to open the door, I just thought to myself, this is going to be interesting. And crawled out on the skid tubes and pretty much kind of stayed there.
I guess it seen me first for whatever reasons, and I was close to Cary, and the helicopter hovered below, and okay, it's time for me to get out. And as I reached my hand up, I remember my friend Cary sitting there saying, I'm not going to make it, I'm not going to live and see my wife and children anymore. And I'm like, he's got family. I'm okay. And I waved him off.
In the meantime, Brian and Randy's hands came apart, and they rescued Cary. I asked him one time, how long could you have held on to those little handles? And he said, maybe 5 seconds. So he was 5 seconds from eternity when he was rescued. And in the process, my brother Brian was rescued last. For 25 minutes, hovered their aircraft at the very surface of the water, and they actually got the bellies of their helicopters in the water, which you just can't do.
I had to keep one eye on the out the left side to see the oncoming wave, and as the crest came up, I had to rise the helicopter up, and then as the trough came, I had to go back down to stay with the survivors.
I saw a helicopter come towards us, and I started praying for Dave Cochran, and it turned and went and picked up Dave, and the pilot had said he was 6 inches under and bubbles were coming out of his mouth.
Death white. He appeared to me to be dead.
I tried to reach up, and they had a rope there that they dropped out and said, put that rope over your shoulders. Well, it was a loop, but I couldn't pull it apart enough to get into it, because my fingers just wouldn't respond. And then a big wave came by about that time. I went underwater.
I saw that they had that rope and they were pulling Dave Cochran in, and I heard Randy Oles say, help me, I can't do this all myself.
Then after I finally got up to the surface again, well, then I felt a person's hand grab the back of my jacket. And from then on, it was blank.
I ended up ripping the hood off his parka. I just was trying to grasp for anything I could get a hold of. And I ended up getting this rope and getting it underneath his arms.
And being unconscious, well, my body was shutting down. There was no question about that.
I don't know how long we actually fought with him. It seemed quite a long time, but he was one of the toughest ones.
A jet helicopter is a awesomely noisy thing to begin with, and it's right there. So it was a very tense situation. I had no strength in my arm, and he could not pull me up into the helicopter by himself, and then the skid of the helicopter went under the water, and my right leg just kind of went up onto that skid, and then there got to be some leverage.
We did pick up, as I remember, 2 or 3 of the survivors, transported them over to Sledge Island, and went back.
First the Evergreen helicopter, and then an Era helicopter with a geological survey expert aboard.
We were just on our first survey flight when we heard the distress call from the flight service tower in Nome. And we were carrying geophysical equipment on our helicopter, and it was specifically modified for our use. So we landed in the field, removed all of our equipment, and then asked the tower, is anything we could do to assist? And they said we could, and we, Walt Grease and myself, decided to see if we could go out to Sledge Island and see if we could help out. We had plenty of fuel, so we didn't need to go and get any more fuel, which is in our favor, because that takes a very long time to get fuel. We had over an hour and a half's fuel on board. So we flew out there, and all the while talking to the air traffic controller. We saw where the airplane was circling, and we didn't see the other helicopter yet. We knew another helicopter was on its way. We didn't actually see it yet. And we flew by and we saw some of the survivors in the water, and Walt did a couple circles around, and we saw one survivor, which we thought Walt saw her most, was in particular trouble, which was Barb.
And the helicopter came toward me, and it came a little closer, and Dave Miles was reaching out, and he came, and I didn't get his hand, or he didn't get mine. I just kind of put my hand up, and I let my gas can go, and I just thought, he's got to get it. But every once in a while I'd look, and he still didn't get it, and he was going farther over, and so I just raised it up again, the other one, And he missed it again, or I didn't catch him, and he said, grab hold of my hand, I've got to get you.
It was very difficult because the waves were going up and down, and the pilot was trying to keep the aircraft outside of the water. And we tried for a while, and it was just seemed like an eternity trying to grab her, but it was very difficult.
My gas can was gone, and something inside of me told me, I have either got to get a hold of his hand now, or I'm not going to make this.
It worked out once where the Walt descended a little bit, and the wave came up at the same time we descended, so the rear skid tube went in the water, and when I was sitting I was in the water, so I got a good hold of the back of her coat and in between her body, in between my knees, and then I said to Walt, I said, I've got a pretty good grip on her.
And I thought, this is not going to work, and so I kicked, and I kind of squirmed, but I couldn't really talk because my head was squished between his knees because he was holding on.
And I said to Walt, how far away is that island? And he said, it's about a mile. And I said, okay. Now I know it's a lot more than a mile, but I said, okay, well, let's go to the island, because I couldn't physically hold her and pull her up into the cabin. It's physically impossible for me to do that.
And Barb is literally dangling by her neck for 2.5 miles until they got by Sledge Island, and then she accidentally was dropped back into the water the second time.
I could feel that this hand that I was trying to support myself with too, to help with some of the weight, was beginning to slip.
By that time, we're getting pretty close to shore, but my grip had slipped a lot, and the way I had her captured was not good. I looked at the island, and I noticed that it was a large rock face, and the beach itself was all heavy rocks, big boulders. And no way was my grip good enough to continue on.
I heard him then say, go down, she's slipping.
I lost the grip on Barb at that time, and then she went back into the water from about 15 feet.
Barb was dropped back into the water the second time, somewhere down there.
We couldn't get the helicopter anywhere close to getting her because the waves were too high. So I told Walt to take me into shore and drop me off, and I would go out and get her. I went into the water above my knees, and I was going in, and just as soon as I went in about to my neck, just immediately all the wind was gone from me. You couldn't even didn't imagine it could be so cold. And then I worked my way out to Barb, and just before I was on rocks deep, and I swam for a while, and I got on another rock just before Barb was there, and I was calling to Barb all the while.
I heard this voice. I was dying in the water, and the Lord gave me this peace, and I started to come out and look at myself lying in the water, and I heard this voice behind me, and I just kind of like came to consciousness, and I turned toward the voice, and there was Dave Miles standing there, and he said, you can make it. Come to me. I can't come to you. And I thought to myself, have I been lying here dying all this time, and I could have walked to shore.
When the helicopters went up on Sledge Island, I guess the one helicopter probably was picking up Barb and went on the other side of Sledge Island, and we didn't hear it, and the other helicopter had went up on Sledge Island, and it just seemed like it was going away, and I thought, it's too far to go to Nome. We'll never make it if they have to go to Nome and come back for us. And it had scared me because I didn't hear them. And Don had said, they're coming back for us.
The first two we got in relatively easy, and then it progressively took longer and longer and longer. I wasn't even aware the fellow in the other helicopter jumped out with Barb.
They took us up to Sledge Island and dropped us off, and Don got sick. And I just walked over towards where Dave Cochran was, and Dave and Cary. And Dave was worried about Barb, and Dave Cochran was sitting there, and all his words were slurred.
I was the last person that was left. I finally felt like, Satan was just really at a tug. We had been over to Russia doing God's work and honoring him, and now Satan is saying, I'm going to get you back because that's my territory. Well, I felt like he was actually just tugging on my legs, trying to pull me underneath the water. And I just said, you know, Satan, you can't do this to me because I'm not yours. I've been bought with the blood of Jesus Christ.
As Eric was bouncing up and down with the waves to pull me up and to pull me in.
The last thing we did is we went to the edge of the island and picked him up.
And then the helicopter came, and it was such a shock to see this helicopter come up the side of this mountain.
I'll never forget David just stumbling to me. Oh, honey, honey, I'm so glad you're here. He didn't want to say, we thought we'd lost you or something. He told me that privately later, but oh, I'm so glad you're here.
And after that, it was just a flurry of activity, really, because then we went up the top of the island, and then everybody was rearranged inside these helicopters, and some people were lying in the cargo area to get everybody back to Nome because we didn't want to make multiple trips.
We were at the top of the island, and we weren't in very good shape. We were a mess. And one in the group was sort of in and out of consciousness.
I just remember laying there crying and thanking the Lord, you know, for saving us, because I just knew that, you know, we shouldn't. There's no way I should be here.
They just put us all in the helicopters and got us back. And God just provided so many blessings along the way. It's just amazing. Even the rescue person, Dave Cochran and I were the only ones who were put on stretchers at that point and taken in the ambulances. In the ambulance, they piled Dave in with me and I believe Pam, and they began to cut off my clothes so they could start to warm me up with blankets. And they were so kind, and the dearest rescue squad man, Terry Wilson, is just a really wonderful Christian man. It's just amazing how God just provided the most gentle people and the most caring people all along the way to help us and be with us. And it's just another provision by the Lord.
What they do when they get them to wherever they are, examine them so thoroughly that they find out what is different from a normal individual, and then they correct that, thinking that heat has to be utilized and applied rapidly.
And I remember in the hospital, somebody saying we were in there 70 minutes. And I thought, no way, because I knew you could only last 20 minutes in there, and that was it. And so I thought, no way we were in there that long. I didn't believe them.
They're all alive, and they survive, and maybe it doesn't look spectacular. But if they'd all drowned, or all died of hypothermia, or the planes weren't nearby, and it took 3 or 4 or 5 hours, the wind came up and the waves came up and they spread them all over creation in the Bering Sea, then it'd be spectacular. So if you look at it one way, yeah, it's spectacular because it came out so well.
He just had something more for us to do yet. That's all I can think of. He wasn't through with us.
That particular rescue, there were heroes. We weren't among them, but there were genuine heroes in that rescue. I think Nome was just like any small town where people come together when other folks need help.
I just went on and did it. I didn't even think about it. The only thing I had a hard time doing was going to sleep that night after it was all over. I was pumped up on adrenaline for probably the next day and a half.
There had to be other forces involved here than just luck, because there were so many, the odds were so stacked against us that normally you wouldn't get, at least in my opinion, 7 survivors out of a situation like that.
Would it have been different if someone else had sat down to the sector who maybe wouldn't have handled it a little bit, would have handled it a little differently? Would it have been different if Nome hadn't been in communication with that VFR target? And frequently they're not. That was a long shot to my way of thinking. Would it have been different if the weather had been much more IFR than it was, which is an extreme possibility, as often happens up there? No opportunity to see anyone in the water.
Some of the miracles, you know, having all these things, if any one of the things, any one of the links doesn't work, then probably they all die. But we're trained to make all the links work, and everybody in that day did their job. Is there something divine about that, or is there just something that the FAA and helicopter trainers and communications specialists have done right to allow that to happen? You can draw your own conclusions.
if any link in that chain of this particular rescue, if any link in that chain would have been missing, they would not have survived. And if you're looking at other mishaps into the Bering Sea, other pilots that have gone down in the water, they didn't have that chain. They did not have those particular links in place, and therefore they didn't survive.
Well, I think a bunch of us looked at it and said that the fact that they were that their crash was even noticed was miraculous. Almost everything involved with that particular rescue was absolutely miraculous. I think that you know, those of us who believe in angels and things like that, our faith was reaffirmed that day.
The power of prayer, it really does work, and I mean, you just can't get away. I don't know, it's just amazing. It's truly, truly amazing.
I do know that, you know, their statement is that God plucked them out of the sea. And I was kind of extrapolating that on one day, and I thought, well, you know, if he did that, then he was sure looking over my shoulder on the radar scope that day and directing my view.
Even though the person at link 2 probably didn't pull me from the water, if that link hadn't been there, the person that pulled me from the water, it wouldn't have mattered, because the chain of events would have fallen apart. And so to have air traffic controllers and helicopter pilots and people who pulled us out of the water, and the fixed-wing pilots who spotted us, and the fixed-wing pilot who took the place of the first guy who spotted us, so that when the helicopters came, they could find us, every one of them is extremely important to us, and we don't ever want to take any of that for granted. We don't want to go away like the story in the Bible with the lepers, that 10 lepers were cured and 1 came back to say thanks. We don't want to do that. We want to be like the one that did come back to say thank you very, very much.
I want to say thank you for being my rescuer.
Oh, thank you very much.
People that are used to dealing with pretty extraordinary situations have looked at this story and have just been absolutely astounded at what you guys did, and your alertness and your flying skills and persistence, and then the brute strength and bravery of the people who reached down and got us right out of the water. I mean, it's just astounding, and we just couldn't let this night go by without gathering as many of you as we possibly could together to acknowledge who you are in our lives, and how grateful we are for the fact that we're alive today, because you risked your lives for us and did what you've been trained to do and then some. And I guess you could call it beyond the call of duty big time.
Police are in this business, firemen are in this business, sea rescuers, Air Force rescuers, all these people fall in the same category. They risk their lives daily, and they need to be recognized. And that's what one of the things that's really come out of this for me, to think about those people more.
It's an interesting sensation to have someone look you in the eye, give you a hug and say, thank you for helping to save my life. It doesn't make you feel like a hero, really. It makes you feel very humble. You know, it's something larger than any self-aggrandizement that you get from being a hero.
A person who I had grown to like very quickly in a couple of hours came over and gave me a hug and said, thank you for saving my life. And there's no award the FAA could give me that would be as meaningful as that.
We look back at this whole experience, and we absolutely stand in awe. We stand in awe of really 2 things when it comes down to it, of the bravery of the men who rescued us. I mean, they risked their lives, absolutely put their lives on the line. Eric Pentalazzi had this helicopter in the water. It could have been all over for him and the people he had aboard who were there to help. And the same thing with the other helicopter. And then we're in awe of the fact that we believe our lives are in the hands of a very powerful God from beginning to end, and that God's used people, very strong, brave, courageous people, but people. And we believe that's how God does things, is uses people to get his job done. And we were the recipients of one amazing rescue.
I just think they're a fortunate group of individuals.